Whether we're talking about communication skills, emotional intelligence, leadership, creativity, decision making, the one thing that really becomes an obstacle in all of these skills is ego. So what exactly is ego? So in this episode, we're going to look at a really useful definition of ego, which will help us to recognize when our consciousness has been hijacked by the ego, and also to understand why ego really is at the root of all negative behaviors and emotions, and how to overcome it so that we can have a much more smooth and enjoyable work life. My name is Gillian Sauls. Welcome to my channel. I've been a professional self-development trainer for almost 30 years now, and this channel will go into all aspects of personal development, such as communication skills, leadership, emotional intelligence, creativity, presentation skills. So if you're interested in these topics, then please do subscribe, join the channel, and let's get on to talking about the ego. So most of us can recognize the very obvious and stereotypical expressions of ego. We think of the boasting, my way or the highway, basically a self-centered person who's only working towards their own agenda. But sometimes we don't recognize the reverse side of the ego, which is I'm not good enough, I don't want to risk making a fool of myself, putting others ahead of ourselves, and passive types of behavior. Now, Carolyn McGue gave a really interesting TED Talk called The Art of Being Yourself. And she used this model of 4 layers of the self. So the outer layer, which is not actually the self, but rather the layer of people's opinions of us, so what other people think of us. And she said there's as many opinions of you as there are people looking at you. And so that's a huge step in our freedom or spiritual awakening, to be more and more free of that layer. Now, the next layer she called the persona. She also called it the wishbone. For myself, I like to call it our highest natural self-expression. But really, it represents the you that deep down you feel that if all your obstacles, if you really were true to yourself, that would be your natural highest self-expression. But then what gets in the way of that is then the next layer, which she called the ego. And she really described the ego as being the voice that either congratulates you, puts you on a pedestal, thinks you're doing great, you're the bee's knees today, but tomorrow it's the reverse. You know, those days when nothing seems to go right and you're not impressed with yourself at all. And so most of our self-images fluctuate between thinking we're great and thinking we're lousy, but those are the voices of the ego. And then finally, in the center is what is the real or the permanent self. So she used the word soul, and she spends a lot of time in India. So she's very familiar with this concept of a self that is permanent, eternal, timeless, like a spiritual, real self. And she used the analogy of sky, that the real self is like a sky, and no matter what the weather is like, that can never affect the sky. It's always itself. Now, really the key for expressing your true highest potential is to reduce that ego, because that actually is what blocks that real inner soul self from expressing itself through the real persona, or the highest kind of persona you can imagine for yourself. So the definition that I like to use for the ego is one that comes from author and actually friend and colleague Mike George. And he described the ego as being attachment to a false or wrong image of yourself. Now that sounds really simple, but let's really break it down. So what does he mean by a false image or a wrong image of yourself, or in a sense, a false identity? So what we do really from very young, and this automatically happens in a society that is helping us to build this fake or false identity, is that we get told who we are. We get told to identify with our looks. You're a pretty girl, you're a clever boy, you come from this type of family, this is what your father does, and then that grows into, my job and my family and my house and my car and my opinion. And so this castle, I love this analogy, we're constantly looking to shore it up, to add more and more bricks with our achievements. And those can be based on very external, obvious things, like what we do, what we have, how we look. But they can also be based on more subtle things, my opinion, what I believe, my way of looking at the world, my personal story. And that's a whole world. We're going to look in depth at both of these sides of the ego. But the thing about this castle, and this is the point that they are wrong or false, is that none of them are really the eternal sky self. They all represent very changeable things, like the ego. Some days we feel our castle is fabulous, it's shining, it's gold, and then other times we don't feel proud of our castle, and we call it ourself. We don't feel proud of ourself, but actually what we're doing is judging ourselves by the bricks in this castle, all these many, many facets of our identity or false identity. Now, of course, because they're not permanent, they're always vulnerable to change. So really, when we talk about a castle, it's more like a sand castle. And the waves of change are constantly threatening to break the castle down, threatening it in some way. And then that leads to a lot of deep sense of insecurity. I think a lot of us are not aware actually of the level of tension in our minds related to this monitoring of, is my image safe, am I approved of, or the ambition or desire to add more and more bricks to the castle to make me feel secure. Now I want to share a really kind of practical example of how protecting this castle, this ego out of fear, really does block the expression of the soul, that sky permanent self, from expressing itself through the persona, in this case of Gillian. So this story was some years ago in India, where I am now, and I was at the side of a stage about to sing. And I felt that symptoms of stage fright coming on, the heart rate increasing, that sort of stomach and nervousness. And I asked myself, what does Gillian want? And when I say Gillian, I'm really talking about this identity related to all those factors, that castle of Gillian, her achievements and her talents. And so in the case of the singing, unconsciously, I was obviously hoping that the song goes well so that I get a few bricks for the castle, bricks about talent or whatever. Now, whenever there's a desire for the ego to add something to this identity, there's going to be fear, because I may not get those bricks, but even worse, I may damage the castle in some way. I might ruin my self-image in some small or big way. And so the result is that tension. Then I asked myself, what does the soul want from this moment? And what was amazing is that my mind went so quiet, and the word nothing came to my mind. That the real self, the internal soul self, didn't need anything from this moment. It had no interest in gaining anything for the castle, because it was so clearly aware that that's not the self. And in that moment of the nothingness, of the quiet mind, like all that fear just disappeared. But what was the most interesting thing was that when Gillian went to sing the song, it really had never been sung so clearly before. it was as if the ego and the fear and all the tension related to that desire and fear, with it gone, the voice was just able to, the soul was able to use the instrument of Jillian, the persona, to really express the highest version of that song in that moment. And when it had finished and everybody was like, wow, that was really nice, it really felt like, oh, they're just talking about this character and this moment. The ego didn't need to feed off that. I didn't need bricks, because I was feeling so separate from the castle and so aware of just the natural attainment and fullness of the real self. People often say, well, without ego, without the desire to add more bricks to my castle and have those achievements, then I'm really not going to be motivated at all. Like, what's the point then? And I think this is a genuine kind of dilemma for people when they do shift out of ego and looking for a more authentic motivation. And so there can be a period of feeling a bit lost, a bit dull and dry, because the ego really gives us adrenaline and cortisol and a feeling of excitement. So that fear and desire give a certain feeling of liveliness, and without it, sometimes it can feel like, oh, nothing inspires me anymore. But you weren't actually inspired in spirit. It was ego looking for food through you. And so there will be this period of adjustment as you really discover your true inspiration and your true enthusiasm, which is very different from excitement. So in future episodes, we're going to look at how this defending this ego castle, this identity, and trying to build it up with ambition, how it really leads to a host of really negative experiences and emotions and behaviors, which all have their roots in this insecurity, this trying to defend a sandcastle. But by recognizing how this ego mechanism works, we can really understand when our consciousness gets hijacked, and then how to bring ourselves back to that center self, the real self, the soul self, the feeling of that freedom of the sky, that needing nothing of the soul. And now that can sound quite abstract, but once you start to really experiment with these concepts internally, they will turn into something that's a self-evident truth. So the idea that the soul needs nothing and the freedom that brings is no longer just kind of a nice concept, but it becomes something that you can really draw on to cope with all sorts of challenges, big and small, that the ego brings on us. So I really look forward for you to join me on this journey. And if you really do enjoy these kind of conversations and topics, I really do encourage you to subscribe to the channel, comment, like, any of those things really help the channel to grow. And thank you for listening. See you in the next video.